So welcome to the fifth lecture in the interdisciplinary online lecture series, Shaping the Future, Female and Queer Perspectives on Possible Future, funded by the 7th Idea Competition for the Advancement of Women at JIU. My colleague Alina and I, we are very excited that so many are joining us tonight for the lecture or the talk given by Professor Greta Olsen and Dr. Birte Christ. Now I'd like to warmly welcome our two speakers, both lecturers at the English department of JIU. Greta Olsen is the head of the English department and professor for English and American Literary and Cultural Studies. She was fellow at the Goethe Hamburger Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities, Law as Culture in Bonn, with which she recently published an article entitled Being in Uncertainty, Thinking the Coronavirus Pandemic. She's the co-founder of the Network for Law and Literature, and she aims at facilitating work on the nexus between political and artistic practice and academic analysis. Her research interests span over cultural approaches to law, law and literature, the politics of form, critical media studies, American studies, and feminism and sexuality. Dr. Birte Christ is assistant professor at the of American Literature, Culture, and Media Studies at the English department at JIU. She is interested in the possible futures for women and especially mothers in German academia. In 2018 and 19, Birte initiated and coordinated a project at JIU which provided 10 women postdocs with children a student assistant in order to maximize the time they would be able to invest into the research that would further their careers. Birte is the author of Modern Domestic Fiction, Popular Feminism, Mass Market Magazines and Middle Class Culture, 1905 to 1925, Winter, published in 2012, and is currently preparing his second book, Imagining the American Death Penalty, Representational and Racial Politics from the Antebellum Era to the 21st Century, for publication. And without further ado, let us all welcome Professor Dr. Greta Olsen and Dr. Birte Christ for their dialogue on resilience, resistance, and healing in anti-gender and pandemic times. So welcome very much. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Birte and I talked a little bit about the dramaturgy ahead of time, and although it would have been in my anti-hierarchical interest that she start, because I'm the one with the permanent job and she does not have that yet, she wanted me to start for reasons of content. And I had to agree, despite the form, that I don't like it. And I want to say what an honor it is to be here tonight and how important I think this initiative is, and to also say the reason I asked if we could be in a Streitgespräch or a dialogue is that one of the issues of the pandemic has been feeling a lack of connection. And I find people are exhausted and unsure of themselves. And what we all know and what is not always easy to achieve is to actually have connection. And Birte and I are actually only a few offices away from each other, but the technology makes, so really we'd like to be in the same room and be able to bounce off of each other, but the technology makes it as such that it's better for you if we're in two different rooms. And in the wish to connect, we're going to do this in dialogue. I'm going to start by sharing a PowerPoint, a first to image. So Anna was kind enough to shape our emails back and forth into a title. And what we want to talk about is resilience, resistance, and healing in anti-gender and pandemic times, a dialogue. And this is a topic I'll be talking about it in a legal context on Friday, and I'll be talking about it in Sarajevo in the fall, that I think really is something that we as queers, as feminists, as trans people, as trans feminists, as any community that is minoritized need to be thinking about. And it's because of the power of what I see as the dominant narrative. And the dominant narrative, and I know my wonderful colleague Dorothea Deneuve spoke about this, is that this pandemic has been terrible. It has been terrible for women. It has been terrible for mothers. It has been terrible for those who do care work. It has been terrible for trans people. It has been terrible for queers. And this is, I could have 100 titles and images on this page, talking about the fact, if we stay with women, a problematic category, but we're going to leave it for the time being. Women have been economically put back at least 10 years, and that we saw after the SARS pandemic that whereas men caught up to speed pretty quickly again, in terms of economics and work, women remained precarious or much more precarious long afterwards. As we know, the pandemic has been used in order to uphold and increase the narrative, gender ideology, and gender ideology, whatever that strange phenomena is, being responsible even for the pandemic and for a loss of natural families, et cetera, et cetera. And as we see most violently in my country of origin in the United States, the pandemic has also been the occasion for a really violent new horse in our perpetual cultural wars, which is anti-trans rhetoric and anti-trans and anti-binary laws. This extends well beyond bathroom bills, in which people must, by law, use the bathroom of the gender they were assigned to at birth. It includes laws in Mississippi and Arkansas that make it illegal for healthcare people to give gender-affirming health care to trans people and trans youth. And it includes to the Miss Fairness bill, a bill in Mississippi, which makes it illegal for trans girls and youth to compete in trans teams. So that reality, and here I'm talking about gendered issues that have to do with sexuality and gender expression, but it also extends in my country of origin to Latinx people and to Black people. It's been terrible. It's been shit. And that is the dominant narrative, and it's really real. And I want to hold on to that. But I also want to say it's not the only narrative. Narratives are powerful. They do things to us and with us. And by just repeating this dominant narrative, we are also, the systemic differences, the systemic fallbacks are real, but we're also conditioning ourselves to be in the dominant narrative of we have fallen back. So in conversation with Birte, who has, as a single mother in a point of precarious employment, managed to do, as I saw, really wonderfully during the pandemic, or at least very, that sounds like a value judgment. We've been talking about alternative narratives. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn over to Birte for a moment.
Mm-hmm. Hello and good evening, everyone. And thank you, Anna and Jana, for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be here with you all and also with Greta. So yeah, I want to speak about the new narrative or the other narrative that I found for myself during the pandemic. And briefly spoken, that narrative says pandemic chaos can also be a liberating force. The pandemic can liberate one from gendered social expectations that come from the outside, but perhaps more so from expectations that we have internalized and things we expect from ourselves. And I will be speaking about this personally in a moment, but since I'm a literary studies person, I have to admit that I understood this only sort of after the fact, when I actually read a novel with a class on law and literature in the late fall of last year. And Elisabeth Herrmann has also talked about narratives about the pandemic and also utopian responses. And I'm now going to go back in history very much to do a similar thing. the novel that made me really see what perhaps had happened to me is the novel Orman by Charles Brockton Brown, written in 1799. The novel, I highly recommend it. Yeah? It discusses gender roles in a time of revolution and Enlightenment philosophy. And the gender roles and how they can be negotiated during this time are contrasted through 4 central women characters: Constance, Sophia, Helena, and Martinette. The protagonist is Constance, but what's important for tonight is that it is set during the Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic of 1793. So Constance is the one who feels the liberating force of the pandemic. How does that happen? She is a single woman who takes care of her old and blind father. So she has a lot of care work to do. She has to cook for him, she has to shop, she has to do all the household chores, and she also has to earn all the money for that little family by taking on sewing work. So when the yellow fever epidemic hits, and by the way, the representation of what happens to the city of Philadelphia and also to its marginalized communities when the epidemic hits are sort of horrifying, and also you somehow think you could almost translate them to the streets of Gießen in 2020. But when this epidemic hits, what happens is that she has no work anymore, so is very soon going to be out of money. But she reads a report on the plague in Naples in medieval times and reads about how the monks in Naples survived on a diet of cornmeal, of polenta, basically. So what she does is she goes out and buys cornmeal for 3 months, which she reckons is a long enough time, and it turns out to be a long enough time in her case. And so she and her father subsist on cornmeal, which means she doesn't have to cook elaborate meals anymore. She doesn't have to go shopping. She doesn't have to dress elaborately because she doesn't go out anymore. They lock themselves up, and she has no paid work anymore. So she has a lot of time on her hands. And here we get into the details of a rather privileged household in terms of education. What she has time to do then, and which makes her really happy, is that she can learn French and Italian from her father. And why does she want to do that? Because then she can, after the pandemic, sort of advance socially and make more money as a tutor for French and Italian. But she doesn't have these skills as the pandemic breaks out. So she's very happy. What I want to share with you is one quote from the novel that describes what happens to Constance when the epidemic ends. So the yellow fever is transmitted by mosquitoes. And that means that it ends when the winter begins. So that explains the first sentence. Meanwhile, the dominion of cold began to be felt, and the contagious fever entirely disappeared. Constance, however, was permitted to take no share in the general festivity. I mean, of course, everyone's happy that they can go outside again, not so Constance. Such was the color of her fate that the yellow fever, by affording her a respite from toil, supplying leisure for the acquisition of a useful branch of knowledge, and leading her to the discovery of a cheaper, more simple, and more wholesome method of subsistence, had been friendly instead of averse to her happiness. Its disappearance, instead of relieving her from suffering, was the signal for the approach of new cares. And what I found here so insightful to my own situation was that actually for me, in many ways, and what resonated with me was that a number of cares were simply taken away from me. And so what actually happened in my personal case was that the moment I realized that kitas and schools were going to be closed in March 2020, I realized that I would not be able to work at all with 2 small kids who were 3 and 6 at the time, if I didn't want to kill myself or make everyone truly, truly unhappy. And I basically decided I'm not going to work at all. That was possible is of course due to the fact that I had the full support of my boss, who was Greta at that time, and also of the university. And of course that the university is structured in such a way that we have a certain freedom of deciding when we're going to do what. So in my case, I taught my classes toward the end of the semester, so in June and July, because we kind of all thought then the pandemic would perhaps be over. I mean, it wasn't, but sort of the first 8 weeks, I just decided I don't have to work. Of course, my self-expectation was, okay, I'm a single parent, I take care of my children, but of course I work full time, would do no less. Yeah. And then I decided, no, I don't have to. And of course, this also applies to many other areas where we can just lower our expectations and the standards. Yeah. Of course, this is a bit different from what many people experience. They had to do more cooking suddenly because kids were at home. So Constance does less cooking, but it's also a lesson to say, yeah, maybe we don't need to cook that elaborately. Maybe everybody can subsist on polenta. So this is the happy narrative that I'm going to tell for now. And I'm going to turn over again to Greta, because this is, of course, a very individualist kind of resilience, yeah, that I found, and that is also echoed in some rather old literature. So, and we want to turn to more communal ways, perhaps, of telling a different story.
With an acknowledgement of the power of narratives, also in determining how we frame our own experience, and how we can be interpolated into them. So as feminists, queers, and minoritized communities, how we can also be worn down by these narratives. I want to think about resistant narratives and the power of resistant narratives also in terms of healing ourselves. And I see three parts of this. And if Birte and I start to get more into it, we can argue about the words resistance, healing, and resilience, all of which are not self-explanatory words. What I noticed is one alternative narrative, which Anna was kind enough to mention, was at the beginning of pandemic, I wrote a piece about being in uncertainty. Also in a legal context, comparing American and US American and German cultures, because I felt there was a huge need, there still is, to impose a narrative on what the pandemic means. And I would still say we don't know. We register differences in our lives, we're going through it. We all have a sense of hope, as we did last summer, that we're coming out of it. I will be seeing my elderly mother for the first time in 2 years, my mourning sister, all of those things, but we really don't know. We don't know what's going to happen in the months and weeks to come. There have been both, as in Birte's case, and this is important and she'll talk more about it, practices of community. There have also been group actions, and I think group actions are really important. And for instance, there has been crowdfunding for trans people in order to get medical attention, also for queers. There have been neighborhood actions in neighborhoods in order to teach people about distancing and to practice that also in an exemplary way. As two visual examples, just briefly, because I found these visuals joyous. In Krakow, people gave out free rainbow masks during the pandemic. And this is important. I found this image in an article from Forbes saying 6 out of 10 queer people in Europe feel afraid to hold a same-gendered person's hand in the street. And this is a form of resistance and activism, even as it's been expressed with joy. We also saw a very conscious alliance. One of the things that I found most powerful in my country of origin in the period after George Floyd's death, where the Black Lives Matter became a George Floyd matter, was an embrace of trans people within the Blackness and a more intersectional view. And this from a Pride event last summer in New York City, Queers for Black Lives, consciously naming alliances, consciously working together. I think that these are forms of resistance to a dominant narrative, and they are also forms of resilience. Those are some of the larger things. I'm going to name one more. In Spain, where there's a huge anti-gender ideology movement, another alliance that's been built is to use the word transfeminist as one word, as to say we will not be divided, and also with a co-option, as we know in a post-feminist culture, a co-option sometimes of feminist motifs and topoi into right-wing discourse to say, this is not our discourse. We refuse to belong to it, and we are redefining ourselves as women, as trans women, in an inclusive way. And Birte, I turn back over to you.
Oh, okay. So maybe I can then ask you how you see the terms resilience and resistance as being connected or not, because I have to say, I'm a bit ashamed of my own narrative of resilience, or I'm always skeptical of myself in that sense, because of course, if you find your private solution to a systemic problem, that can make you very complacent. After the 8 weeks of sitting, I actually didn't sit at home with my kids. I went on beautiful excursions for 8 weeks and had the best time of my life, during the pandemic. So I was totally content. I solved things for myself with a lot of luck and circumstances that supported me, but it didn't make me political or resistant in any way. So I'm really skeptical about how much resilience is actually good for you, because it makes you think things are okay and you can solve them on a private level instead of a political one.
Okay, but before we take apart resilience, like good academics, let's get our terms clear. Why don't you talk about some of the private forms of resilience you practiced, and also in terms of norm breaking activity, because I think a lot of it is about norm breaking.
In terms of sort of more communal activities. Yeah, so I can talk a little bit more about what happened after we all realized the schools and kitas wouldn't open. So what I actually did, and I have to say that the pandemic changed myself in certain ways, because usually if I had childcare problems, I would solve them due to my economic privilege and just pay babysitters all the time. And of course, all of that broke away with the pandemic. And so I joined or potted with other parents. And what we did was for basically the months of, and they were also university teachers. So from mid-May to mid-July, we shared our 4 kids. So they were 2 parents. They took care of the kids for 3 days. I took care of them for 2 days. And basically, as the pandemic went on, other things happened. The kita reduced their opening hours. So basically, to this day, my neighbors who live in the same house and who are doctors and leave the house every morning at 10 to 7 can't really get their kids to school and to kita anymore. So the 2 kids have breakfast at my house and I take them to school and to kita. And why am I here? Because right now they're taking care of my kids and they were with them at the pool, maybe if the weather was good enough this afternoon. So, and this is of course an anti-neoliberal form of organizing care, which I would not have engaged in, thinking, it's too much hassle, you have to deal with other people. And of course you have, but it's also very enriching. And this is something that, interestingly, however, people from the outside can't sometimes understand. So I was really struck by how few people in my direct environment have actually engaged in these practices, and maybe because they are 2 people. So I think I was also prone to seek out others and say, I can't do this on my own. I really need to join forces because otherwise it's not going to work. And it has done me good. And I just hope that, I am sure that I will be able to take this idea of things can work differently and can be differently, that I can take that sort of over into a hopefully post-pandemic world. But I hope that that will happen sort of on a broader level, that we get away from the nuclear family and from sort of outsourcing things basically by paying for them.
You're talking about systemic change. And I think that hesitation you had with my naming resilience, and I just edited a piece on feminist resilience, so that was reverberating and resonating in my mind. is I'm not talking about a lean-in feminism. And I'm not talking about that we as individuals need to be entrepreneurial and figure things out. I want to be straight, very aware of my privileges. I have a permanent job. I have not suffered any material hardship, and I see this constantly in contradistinction to other places in the world, or people that I know who have died of COVID, and there's nothing more drastic than that. And people are separated from people who have died during COVID, also drastic. For me, resilience is not, you need to be tougher, you need to do more. It is resisting a dominant narrative of pulling you down. So again, I'm going to go back to the example of Spain, of feminazis are responsible for the COVID because they celebrated Women's Day. And a real decision, they are following usage by others to say we are trans feminist and to get away from that usage. I see forms of communal activity. Many queers who are often isolated have always needed to use the digital in order to reach out. So in a piece that we both read called "This Ain't So Bad," or "Everything Getting Me Through This Pandemic I Learned from Being Queer" by Mike Brewer, he says, well, wake up world, this is what it feels like to be queer. You're isolated, you're by yourself, you have to use social media, you have to find new ways of connecting, you have to figure things out. And as he writes, for many queers, digital medias and the social conditions that necessitate them are central components of queerness. I learned to embrace intimacy from afar, accept distance as fundamental to queer ontologies, and to see physical separation not as a barrier but as a viable modality for unique connections. And folks have begun to not only utilize these resources, but to see them as viable and vital modes of world making, a queering indeed. So resilience is to say, for me, the pandemic is real, the losses are real that have been thematized in this room. It is also, to the degree we can, resist the effects of the pandemic through structural work and through more communal activities. And it is also, and this is a big subject, it is through practices of healing. I came to practices of healing. I'm not a psychotherapist, and I'm not particularly esoteric, and I'm not a healer. I was teaching a course on racism during the winter term, and I noticed my students and myself, it was a long and difficult winter. Our second Corona winter, were becoming more and more down through the course material. And although we started with America, we rapidly got into forms of racism in Germany, which the majority of students had experienced because they looked ethnically Asian, because they had a non-Bio-Deutsch Name, because they had a darker complexion, et cetera, et cetera. And I realized as the course went on that if I was responsible for it as the facilitator, I had to do something. So we started pragmatically writing down, what can we do to address this? What do you do in Germany when you are the object of, or you witness forms of racism, for instance? So we started a whole list of actual practices, but we also, at the end, started to practice forms of healing. And I believe this care work for ourselves and for each other is really necessary, and creating connection through that. And I know that's huge and vague and large, but I find it is one form of actual resilience and resistance. And with that, I turn back over to you.
Can I ask you a question directly? Because for those of us who may not be teaching courses that are in their content directly related to healing and resilience, how do we, because I really think, we've been talking about marginalized groups, and we're talking here about women and what the effects of the pandemic are. We have seen the New York Times article, women are being thrown back 10 years. I honestly think that sort of the biggest division perhaps historically is not going to be between the genders and who's been thrown back, but really between generations. And in a way, I've been a bit helpless in front of my computer, looking at my students and thinking, for them, they can't just sit it out. I mean, for me, whether a summer is not my summer, who cares? I'm 43. If you're 22, there is no next summer. And there's also no next, year abroad, et cetera, et cetera. So what does one do in, say, a situation where you teach Charles Brockenbaum may be a good way to talk about the pandemic situation, but what if you teach the sonnet cycle? How do you still create the connection and perhaps ways of being resistant in class?
Can I answer indirectly? And I'm going to say, I agree with you. First of all, I want to agree with you, although it's much more interesting when we disagree. But I agree with you with the privilege of age. I'm pushing hard on the pedal of 60, and I'm really aware I've been through many life crises and have that knowing in my bones of things get better. And I saw that for instance, for my students or for the 16-year-old that I have at home, this was really different. And he's a pretty well-adjusted 16-year-old, but he said to me in February or March, the day is a field of gray, and I don't see any differentiation in it. So I'm really aware of that. And we have to speak about our privileges, but that being aware of privilege cannot be a form of debilitating our sense of agency. And what I mean by that, we have all had losses through this pandemic. And this is a piece that I read from the New York Times. I can't complain, but, and that is a sense for those of us, and I suspect it will be everyone in this room, because you have the space and time to be in this room, who was not in duress, physical or duress, that there was a sense of almost apologetic, I'm having a really hard time right now, or there are things that I miss, or there are things that hurt or are painful. And I think we have to name them. I think we have to be specific about them. I think this is a practice of healing, and I think we have to mourn what we've lost through the pandemic, including a sense of connection often. And then from there, we can start to do healing practices. So, I'm sort of beyond good and evil, and I practice these things in class, and I have to think about how you're going to integrate this into a sonic cycle. But for instance, I practice breathing exercise by the Navy SEALs called box breathing. You breathe in, we can all do it. You breathe in 4, you hold for 4, you breathe out 4, you hold for 4. It helps you to calm down. And it's something developed by Navy SEALs that maybe makes, for some of us, it easier to accept than if a yoga instructor talks about it, depending on where you are and, whatever the lifestyle or ideological system. I also talk about very specifically, because in the racism class, I started to introduce this practices of gratitude. So if you're having a hard time, and I know this from I've had more life crises than anybody wants to know about in this room. And it's something that I've practiced during recent ones. You write down each night 5 things that you feel grateful for. And it becomes repetitive, but it's very helpful. It's cognitive, it's behavioral. So I do these things with my students in class. I take the time. They see me closing my eyes and doing box breathing, or writing expressively, or doing expressive artwork to say how much I miss my mother and sending it to her afterwards. And it's a form of practice. Moving from there, from the individual, aware of this is perhaps, I believe, something that I can do on an individual level, also to say that this is maybe talking about healing and care is something that we need to be doing more in universities. Particularly when, as I find, many of my students are struggling, and they're strong students, but they're worn down, they're unsure of their voices. I believe it's something that we can incorporate every day.
Okay, let me be devil's advocate and be very cynical and say, so when are we going to teach the sonnet sequence? I mean, don't we do enough sort of pastoral care work all the time already?
You know, straight up. And we have many colleagues that would say, you know, now you've gone from cultural studies, which was once said when the GCSE was being evaluated in the second round. What is that? Twilight studies? You know, that's not about anything. And what are people going to do with a degree in Twilight studies? I think you can definitely say what I hope I'm teaching when I'm not practicing care work is critical thinking. So last night in the Vorlesung, where I was surprised that people came, I was talking about the Alan Kurdi photographs. And I was talking about practices of seeing and framing these photographs and how they've been mediated and what that means. And the discussions of whiteness, the discussion of how the boy's name is spelled, et cetera, et cetera. I believe those differentiations, which you are practicing and looking at sonnets, are valuable. I don't see them as so qualitatively far apart from each other.
You've convinced me. So where do we go from here?
Okay. I want to read something beautiful by a trans author about connection. But it's, you know, this is very sort of feel-good academia, but it has been helpful to me. My sister is in mourning, and I send her pictures of something beautiful that I try to see, something visual every day. And it's a way of saying, I'm very far away from you, but this is a way that we can stay connected. So that'll be my final point. And then Birte, maybe you can see if we should talk some more about, yes, resilience can definitely be understood as neoliberal, and it can be co-opted. And it can also be a strategy for keeping ourselves all sane and whole. So one of the wonderful things that happened to me this winter, and I had a hard winter. My son moved to America with my grandchildren. My brother-in-law died, and I lost some people to COVID. And I was trying to hold it together and to, in my own limited, circle, be something of a leader. And I was touched that 3 women who don't know me very well sent me gifts. No birthday, no big experience. And they had a sense, although I hadn't said, you know, my son just moved to America with my grandchildren, I haven't seen my mother in 2 years, that something was wrong. And so that is a form of deep connection. And one of them is a book by Kay Tempest on connection. And I'll read just one paragraph. It could be that connection to another deeper world is most easily experienced by artists. But really, anyone who's ever meditated, prayed, studied the stars, cooked an important meal for people they love, thrown a punch, received one, built something with their hands, learned a skill because they had no choice, been in service to others, volunteered their time, found themselves at the edge of their sanity or at the edge of their experience, accepted a difficult truth, put themselves second, genuinely gone out of their way for somebody else, has felt it. Connection is not the sole domain of artists, but art is a good way of understanding the fruit of that other place where commonality begins. So Birte, although in our assigned roles that I'm more the cultural studies and media person and you're more the literary studies person, I want to say that imagining of a literary voice and how it can create a sense of connection.
Thank you, Greta. I hesitate to say anything after that. And I think since we're speaking about connection, we want to hear from all of you, especially. But what I want to add is that I'm sort of humbled by this very project, even in the title, you know, Shaping the Future. I mean, basically, Anna and Jana, what you gave everyone is the space to connect and to connect about these issues. So I feel a bit, I truly feel humbled because, you know, like Greta and I mean, Greta does a lot in her courses, but I really only teach the sonnet cycle. So I feel like it could have been my job, or this is something to perhaps do in the future to create exactly these spaces of connection. So thank you so much for that. And
yeah, thank you very much, Birte. And yeah, I think our idealism has definitely also kind of, driven us to also create this whole lecture series in the first place, maybe. But I hope that this idealism is also not misplaced, but that good can come out of it. And yeah, I can definitely only encourage everyone here if they're struggling to reach out, even though I know that at times it can be really tough to voice, that you're struggling. But that's also why I found what Greta said right in the beginning about writing, and also writing down things that you're grateful for, but sometimes also things that you struggled with, and also acknowledging what you did well on a certain day, like practicing mindfulness to a certain extent is really helpful. And also there I find this concept of resilience, reading maybe narratives that are about resilience, but also writing as a practice to foster resilience in a way, a really helpful way of finding coping mechanisms and strategies. So thank you very much. I'm not sure if there are any more questions. There are more words of thanks, and I also thank everyone. Yeah.
And I don't want to be the last person who speaks, please. So Birte or somebody else say something after me. I just want to thank Anna and Alina and all of you for creating the space. It's felt really good and very real, and I really appreciate what you're doing.
If I manage to unmute myself, I'm gonna do what Greta asked me to do and speak words after her. And I just want to thank everyone for sort of the plurality here of experiences, because while we were speaking, I realized that while I have reflected a lot about the situation, it's maybe not been enough, because you hear different voices every time, and it's really important in that sense to stay connected. And I've learned a lot tonight. So thanks, everyone.